Thank you so much, Mitchell, for the very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you, Rachel, for organizing and bringing me here from California. Can you all hear me? Okay. I promised Mitchell I'll keep my talk short, just to 30 minutes, so we can have Q&A and discussion. As I would love to hear from you all as well too. So when I told Rachel the title for the talk, "The Long View of a Tragedy," I picked the title because in my research in being in Gujarat over the last 3 years, when I first went to Gujarat, I thought I would write a book about the Gujarat riots, having witnessed the riots myself, and it still being a very pressing question, particularly now with Narendra Modi, the Chief Minister of Gujarat, now becoming India's Prime Minister as of May 16th. And I want to begin with a story that explains why I chose the title, "The Long View of a Tragedy." And this story sort of shows how my thinking on Gujarat has evolved over the last 3 years, and my thinking as a human rights advocate has been challenged by a lot of my work in Gujarat. So on February 28th, 2002, a 33-year-old woman named Abida was living in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, the most populous city in India's western state of Gujarat, with a population of about 7 million. February 28, 2002, of course, was the day after a train was attacked in the Gujarat city of Godhra, about 4 hours away, where 58 Hindus were killed. And the Indian courts later ruled in 2011 that the train was attacked by a group of Muslims. So they were indicted. On February 28th, the day after the train burning, 2002, Abida received a text message from one of her neighbors saying a Hindu mob was coming to their neighborhood in Naroda in Ahmedabad seeking revenge. She was married. She has 2 young children. And so she and her 2 young children, they left their home and they went to their in-laws' home in Juhapura. Juhapura is a Muslim ghetto of Ahmedabad, which now has about 400,000 people. Her husband stayed back at the house along with a lot of the other men. And I know in hindsight it looks like a very foolish, a very stupid decision, but I have to keep in mind that Ahmedabad is a city that has had riots, major riots in 1969, 85, 92, and of course in 2002, with many skirmishes in between. And he thought that the steam would blow off very quickly. That's actually the word that Salman Rushdie very famously said about the 2002 riots: the steam would blow off quickly. So he stayed back at the house, and a few hours after Abida left, her husband was burned alive. She went to go stay with her in-laws, and she didn't return back, and she hasn't returned back to her home ever since. So now the reason why I began with this story is that when I first went to Gujarat in 2011, and I quit my job in the U.S. Congress, and I met Mitra that summer, I really thought that in writing about Gujarat, I would focus on stories about what happened to her on the 28th of February. But as I spent a lot longer with her, and it's been 3 years now since I've been meeting with her and many others like her, I started seeing that the story and the tragedy was very different than what I had imagined. When you write a story, you're sort of looking at what is the arc of the story, and I thought that the high point of the tragedy would be her husband being killed, and it is a tragedy, and there's no question about it. And I think the failure of the Gujarat government is still a very pressing question, even though the courts have absolved Modi of guilt, which we can talk about in the Q&A. But as I spent more time with Abida, I began to realize that my questions, coming in particularly from a human rights background, having spent 9 years doing human rights work in DC, were very narrow. One of the reasons why I met with some wonderful students last night from UW-Madison, and they asked me a question, and I didn't really sort of think of the answer until this morning, which is, why did I go to Gujarat? I went to Gujarat partly because of my own sort of trauma of witnessing the riots, my own sort of questions about, interviewing these young children whose parents are burned alive and wondering sort of, a decade later what happened to them. But it was also with my own frustrations with human rights work in D.C. And I understand the limitations of groups like Amnesty and what their value is. But in looking at questions about impunity and the Gujarat government's response, and particularly Modi's response or lack thereof, there was a lot about Abida's life that I missed that I wanted to share. So after the riots, she began to live with her in-laws. She was 33 years old. She had never worked. She got married when she was 18. She had 2 young children. And after the riots, many widows, particularly in their 20s, were married off to suitors from Lucknow or from Hyderabad, India, or maybe from abroad. Abida's parents, her in-laws, didn't let her marry again. They thought that would be unfair to her children. Her parents didn't want her to move back. They didn't have space. There was partly these economic reasons. And the Gujarat government gave her a very small amount of compensation for her home that was burned down. It was about $845. It was hard to go back to where she had lived in Ahmedabad, in Naroda, so she ended up living in this rehabilitation colony in Juhapura, in Ahmedabad, called Siddiqabad, which was started by the Tablighi Jamaat, which is like a sort of I guess you could call them, for lack of a better word, sort of an evangelical sort of Muslim group that is sort of transformed into social services. And that was supposed to be a makeshift place, and they were promised that they would build them a school, that there'd be a sewage line, etc. And it's been, I guess, 11 years, and she still lives in the same place. In the area of Juhapura, which is sort of pejoratively known as Chota Pakistan or Mini Pakistan, the road that the periphery road of Juhapura is known as the border. It's sometimes very difficult to get rickshaws in and out. I've lived down the street from Abida for the last few years. Abida had a hard time getting back on her feet, finding work. Today she works she sews clothes, and on good days she makes about 150 rupees, which is like $2.50. Her school, in Juhapura, the government hasn't built many schools, and so each year there are about 2,000 school children that do not have access to school because the government has not provided schools. After the riots, there was initially a lot of secular NGOs had helped out, but a lot of that help dried up. And I remember when I was an advocate and meeting with some of the donors I went to Amsterdam and London, and then in California, Silicon Valley, and they're saying, well, we want to help both communities. But the riots were not a situation in which sort of both communities were affected. There were obviously Hindus that were killed in Godar, and that is a tragedy that we cannot deny. But the riots were very lopsided. And so when the violence is lopsided, then the intervention also has to be lopsided as well, but a lot of donors weren't comfortable. So the main groups that were helping out were these sort of conservative Muslim groups that increasingly had a strong grip. So today, Abida, she's 45, she still works. Her kids have a lot of trouble in school. Her daughter's 15 now. And each time I meet her, she talks about how, they have these mass marriages that they do in Ahmedabad every summer. And one had as many as 237 women were married off to, men from Bradford or from Hyderabad or Lucknow or, various different parts, anywhere but Gujarat. And she's saying, I'm just going to marry my daughter off. Now, the reason why I began with this, and I know, sorry, it's kind of I know this is sort of like a depressing way to start, is that the longer that I've spent in Gujarat, the more that I started seeing the tragedy unfolding in a very different way. That in writing about the Gujarat riots, I realized that to just focus on what happened to her in this narrow window of time, February 2002, was missing so many of the other tragedies that have happened in her life that implicate so much more than just the Gujarat state. What we have, when you see a case like Abida, and there's so many cases like her, is it's not just the failure of the Gujarat state, but it is also the failure of secular NGOs. It is the rise of a lot of conservative Muslim groups that have stepped into the space, which oftentimes are not equipped or not trained professionally in dealing with rehabilitation. But it is also the very narrow way in which we've looked at Gujarat. So I was in India from September 2013 until just this summer, and people like Abida and others were regularly, stories of prominent newspapers who wanted to go and ask her, well, tell us about Modi, and tell us what happened in Gujarat, and tell us what happened in Fair, and tell us what you feel about your husband, being killed. Aside from it being a very difficult story for her to talk about, I mean, the only way that I could get her to share her story with me, and also the sort of the contours of the story, the fact that she still lives with her in-laws, the fact that they are verbally, I've seen them be verbally abusive with her, and I suspect they're physically abusive as well too. Those are details that it's hard to pull out from the story, but everyone is saying, well, is Modi at fault or not? And even now that he's prime minister and now he's coming to the US on September 25th, those questions still persist. And there are important questions, and I know there's a number of lawyers in this room, and I think the legal questions about Modi still are still there. But I think there's so many aspects and so many uncomfortable questions about what is happening in India that get ignored about ghettoization. Because when I went to Gujarat in 2011 and I started writing, I really thought I would write about sort of 2002, but I began to see that the ghettoization was something that I found a much harder reality to stomach. Both my own challenges as a Muslim in finding housing in Ahmedabad, even though I am a US citizen, but also the way in which ghettoization manifests itself. The fact that you have young Gujarati Muslims who don't speak any Gujarati, the fact that food is now taken on a communal angle. So for those of you who are Gujarati or know Indian food, something like tepla, which is like this bread you eat in the morning. I grew up eating tepla because my parents they're Indian from Tanzania, so my grandparents actually left India in 1925 for Tanzania. And interesting enough, when my parents first came to America, they first landed in Madison. My dad was at the medical school here. So food has also taken on that communal angle. And in the way in which we've understood Gujarat, and we're so preoccupied with the question of Modi, and I told one of the students last night, I've sort of gotten bored with answering these questions, but I'm happy to speak about them because there's so many challenges that remain in Gujarat that get ignored by that. And that I also raised Abida's story because it helped me understand when I first got to Gujarat in 2011 and when I had met Mitra, and I would tell people, Muslims in this ghetto that I'm writing about the 2002 riots, they would laugh at me, and they would say that it's a particular luxury that I have to write about. And it's something that I always question myself, and the luxury that I have as an American with the luxury of taking my passport and going back to the US if something happens to me. But a lot of the challenges that she has, the lack of schools, the lack of jobs, the employment discrimination. So I wanted to use that story to sort of raise a series of questions, and then hopefully that will start our discussion. But the first one is about the notion about being a minority. So in I think March, I heard a really brilliant speaker, Faisal Devji, who's an Oxford scholar, and he spoke about Pakistan in Bombay, about Jinnah. He has a book called Muslim Zion. And he had this interesting idea about, we always speak about Muslims being a minority in India, and they are a minority. They're about 12% of the population. In some places it's more, some places it's less. But what's interesting to me about this Muslim ghetto that I've been living in, there are about 400,000 people, is that in my world, and sorry this is going to sound crude, but Hindus really don't exist in my world. I have a lot of Hindu friends, and I go hang out and go to movies and go to dinners with Hindu friends, but in my neighborhood, I never see Hindus. I mean, maybe they'll come on Sunday nights for eating non-veg food like tandoori chicken and stuff, but you'd never really see, and I don't even hear Gujarati spoken much. So when I want to buy, and I grew up eating a lot of these Gujarati foods like dokla and khaman and stuff like that, I have to cross over, take one rickshaw from this Muslim ghetto, take it to the border, then take a Hindu rickshaw to this place called Vastrapur, or I go to Vejalpur, and then I buy my Gujarati snacks, and then I come back. And it's become so when I'm in India, I don't really think much about it. When I come back to the US and I'm sort of looking at my notes, I think that's a very bizarre thing. And so to me, it's a really fascinating thing that's happening in India, is that there's this ghettoization that it's been going on for a long time. And I think when people talk about ghettoization, I think that people always say, oh, this happens in Delhi, this happens in Calcutta. It does, absolutely. But I think that when we speak about Hindu-Muslim violence in India, we too oftentimes, in trying to get sort of the full picture, which is important, we ignore that for many Muslims, or at least in Gujarat, that the Hindu majority doesn't really exist. It exists as the shadow. And I see it more when I'm with my friends in Juhapura and they go outside the area and they feel very uncomfortable. And one of the most moving things for me was when I was with a good friend of mine from Juhapura, and he was at an electronics store. We were just shopping, and he needed to get something, and the manager was being a real jerk. And I said, you should say something. And he said, no, because they're Hindus and we're Muslims, and you never know what he thinks. And it's something that I, as an outsider, never really thought about. But it's that insecurity that people think about. So the first is this idea about what does it really mean to be a minority? There's no question that Muslims are a minority in Gujarat, and the ghettoization is part of their minority status. But in these enclaves, Okla and Delhi, in Juhapura and Ahmedabad, Muslims are a majority. And that's led to a whole host of other issues. The rise of the Tablighi Jamaat, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's created issues. Sunni-Shia tension is a problem, and I saw that during the month of Muharram, the Shia month of mourning. The second question is about the notion of how we understand suffering. So now, I chose not to show pictures today, not because I was being lazy or because I don't have them. I'm happy to email some photos if you would like. But in my experience of showing photos, people generally tend to get disappointed. Gujarat is one of the largest has one of the largest coastal ranges in Gujarat, and it's always been an economically prosperous state. And so when you look at the Muslims who were affected by the 2002 riots, many of them bounced back very, very quickly, partly because like my family that's spread out, across the world, many Gujaratis have family all over. And so many people who suffered in the riots could very quickly, buy another home or build another bungalow, etc. And so when you look at the way in which people spoke about Gujarat in the lead up to the election, they'd say, well, Muslims have a higher rate of literacy, Muslims have a higher income level, and these are indeed true, but I don't think it ignores the issue of ghettoization. And I think partly it's because when people look at what's happening in Gujarat, they oftentimes rely too heavily on a class lens. But what really intrigued me about Juhapura is that on my street, when I've kept the same flat for 3 years, you have a famous judge, Justice Devecha, who his house was burned down, and he hates living in the area because he's never lived next to Muslims, and now he's 81, I think, and for the first time in his life, he's living next to Muslims. You have rickshaw drivers. You have a whole wide range of people. And someone did a really funny critique of my writing, and all they did was they posted photos of this area and said, oh, look at all these Audis in Juhapura. Look at, there's even a Harley Davidson, or whatever it's called. I mean, it's true, there is a nice Harley in my area, but that doesn't deny the fact that it is a ghetto. In fact, if anything, this sort of underscores my point. The third issue is gender. And this, I have to say, took me a really long time. It's partly why it's taken me so long to work on this book, is that when we look at the 2002 riots, or even Muzaffarnagar, there were riots in Muzaffarnagar in Uttar Pradesh in a year ago, actually, September. I was there in October, a month later. There's been a lot of great reports about the absolutely horrific violence against women, both in Gujarat 2002 or in Muzaffarnagar 2013, and some absolutely incredible, just harrowing stories that emerged. And when I went, I saw it was unimaginable. It was really unimaginable. But what I think is lacking is looking at sort of the long view of how gender or how women are adversely affected by riots. So if you look at someone like, Abida, and the many widows of 2002 and now in Muzaffarnagar, there's very little effort to create skills, to create employment, and a lot of the secular NGOs will just go, or the Islamic NGOs will go and they provide the immediate help, and sometimes the only solution is, get them married if they're of a certain age. But there isn't really much. There really isn't much effort for long-term rehabilitation or trying to examine how women are most vulnerable, both at the time of the actual violence, but in the aftermath as well too. So if you look at Muzaffarnagar, Muzaffarnagar was a very different riot. It was rural. It was women were, in many ways, they were similar because women were, adversely affected. But what was very different was that in Gujarat 2002, there were some amazing secular NGOs and Hindu activists in Gujarat that did brilliant work. I didn't see that in Muzaffarnagar. It was particularly Jamaat-e-Islami, this conservative Muslim group. And I went to go interview the director in October, and they have never hired a woman on staff. And they're working in a relief camp which is predominantly women. And many of the relief camps were run by women. And it's been a year after Muzaffarnagar. You have all these women who are widowed. And partly in me writing about Gujarat 2002, looking at it now 12 years later, I was with a friend of mine who was displaced from 2002, and I'll never forget what she said. She said, in Muzaffarnagar, she said, this is exactly like Gujarat all over again. She said, I can just see what's going to happen. These women are widowed. They're not going to be able to find employment. They'll be pressured into marrying. They'll have to live with their in-laws. They might face abuse, and that sort of spiral just continues. And I think the failure for people to look sort of long-term at what happens, particularly for women, is a problem. And the last issue I wanted to raise, since I know there's some media students here, is the role of the media. I think what's happening in India is very distressing. India has always had challenges of free speech. We saw this under the Congress Party. We saw this with the banning of Salman Rushdie's book before even Iran did. But it's particularly true now. It's increasingly more difficult to write about Modi, to write about the 2002 riots. But I will say also that the reporting has been done has oftentimes been very narrow. So if you look at, what's in Gujarat, when you look at what is sort of the riot-affected area, the riot-affected areas are seen as sort of the Muslim areas. But to me, one of the most difficult things about witnessing the riots in 2002 was that, posh streets in Ahmedabad, like the CG Road, which is like where like the Bose store is, and all these like Levi's store, that was also riot-affected. But when journalists oftentimes write about sort of a riot-affected area, they go to these Muslim localities and they find people like Abida, and I recognize that I've also done my share of that too, but I'm trying not to do that now. But in terms of interrogating the majority and interrogating those who actually, that still hasn't happened. And I think those questions haven't been raised. So in concluding, since I promised to finish at 12:30, I wanted to make a comment about memory. Since today, of course, is the anniversary of the tragic 9/11 attacks, and as I was walking here, there's a very moving display of these flags on the lawn by one of the buildings here. And in a few weeks, it's also the anniversary of the devastating pogrom against Sikhs in 1984. I think one of the things that to me that is a reoccurring theme that that keeps coming up is this idea of memory. And what does it mean to remember Gujarat 2002 or Muzaffarnagar? One of the things that I think, I know I promised I wouldn't speak about Modi, but I'll make an exception here. But Modi has done very brilliantly. And there's a good book by Nilanjana Mukhopadhyay, and I've memorized the page number because it's the most important. You don't need to read the book, but just read this page. Open up to 273 of this book, where Modi says there's one group, a conspiratorial group that has kept the hurt alive, and it is those that are speaking about 2002. I think that one of the things that we see happening it may appear that there's a lot of discussion about Gujarat 2002, and it will come up next week a lot when Modi comes to the United States. Every journalist will have to throw in a line about what happened in 2002. But there really hasn't been a robust discussion of what happened then and what are the challenges that remain. There are very few people that are working on this. And that's partly because Modi has very brilliantly pivoted. I mean, what we see happening in India is, and understandably because the economy is not doing so well, is there's this whole obsession about development, and that development is how India can get through, and India should be like China. And it seems like when people do try to remember, then they're oftentimes seen as anti-national or being, or that they are not moving India forward, that they're in fact hurting society, that they're the ones causing these divisions. And generally when I get criticized in India or in the US, it's always like, well, just don't talk about these things and things will be okay. I want to sort of end on one thing, that the one thing that's moved me the most, and that always sort of brings me to tears when this happens, is that, when I write an article in Gujarat, and after living there for a few years, I always get these messages on Facebook from people. Sometimes they're ugly messages, but oftentimes they're young Gujaratis who are 20 years old, which means that they were 8 years old when the riots happened, and many of them are Hindus. And I'll tell this one story. This one young woman who was 22 when we met last year. She said, I can't speak to my parents about it. I can't speak to my teachers about it. It's, how do you find something on Google? There's so much information. At the university, they don't want to talk about it. And so this young woman, she had read one of my articles, and she was saying, I just want to know what happened. So we didn't talk about Modi. I thought, let's put Modi aside. I just tried to explain to her. But she didn't know where to go to. And I think on some level that gives me a tremendous optimism, because you have a young group of, a new generation that's curious to understand about her own city. And she felt that there's just so many subjects that you just can't talk about. And if you do, just don't talk about it. No, don't talk about it, because it'll. But that also makes me, that also frightens me a little bit too. The reason why it frightens me is because, I get asked all the time, what's going to happen under this new government? I mean, Modi's been in power for, 115 days or something like that. So it's too early to tell. I do think that these questions about the riots, about the ghettoization, are really pressing questions that really haven't been raised. And I think there's a tremendous appetite for these questions. And what I see happening, and what really worries me the most, is that there's a constant effort to sort of cover these things up. And I see the tension just growing and growing. And I think that part of how Gujarat can heal, if there is a robust discussion of what happened. And that's what I try to do with my writing. And I hope that I've helped in some way in trying to raise those questions. So that's it. Yeah. But thank you so much.